A lot has changed since the outbreak of the Syrian war 10 years ago, but in many ways, the vulnerabilities of the Syrian people are as prevalent as ever. There is no place that better illustrates those vulnerabilities than right here at Al-Hol camp, home to both Daesh relatives and sympathizers and Daesh victims. There's been a sharp uptick in violence in this camp over recent months, a testament to both an increased Daesh sentiment in the camp and to a lack of basic water, medical care, and food. Roya is here to understand the stories of the residents and to answer the million-dollar question: when can we go home?
احنا هم نريد نناشد الرأي العام، احنا هم نريد نناشد الرأي العام.
هذا هو رسالة.
احنا نريدهم حتى يساعدونا احنا هنا بالمخيم.
احنا انجبرنا يعني نعدينا ويا داعش، لان احنا من صار الجيش تقدم على الفلوجه كلها طلعت الى لازم والما الى لازم، كنا انسحبنا وصرنا ضحايا يعني سواء داعش او مو داعش. فاحنا هسه طالبين من عندكم انتم مخيم الهول ان تشوفونا شارع، احنا نريد نطلع للعراق.
In the last few years, there's been this mystery surrounding Al-Hol camp. It's oftentimes nicknamed the Daesh camp. In some ways, I think that fascination comes from Daesh itself, and then in other ways it comes from the amount of Western citizens that are at the camp. People think, wow, a British citizen in the middle of Syria, how can that be? And so I started thinking about this more and doing some research, and pretty quickly I found out that 90% of the people at this camp are actually Syrian and Iraqi, and that floored me because you would absolutely never know that by the way that it's reported on. And so while I'm doing this research, the United Nations came out with this list of over 50 countries that still have citizens at that camp. And on that list were Syrians, Iraqis, but also Lebanese, Palestinian. And we called the Palestinian Foreign Ministry, and they said, yeah, it's true, we do have citizens at this camp, and they call us and they tell us, get us out of here, you know, the humanitarian conditions are horrible. And what I think is really interesting about the publication of that list is you can try to find it on Google because the full list is published, but it's so buried underneath the headlines of UN comes out with list of shame, including Britain, US, and France that have citizens at Al-Hol. So it became quite apparent to me that truly nobody cared about the Arab citizens at the camp. And then you put that together with the fact that at the beginning of 2021, there was a massive uptick in violence at the camp, and that additionally, we're approaching the 10th anniversary of the Syrian war. I just thought to myself, we have to go to that camp because it just doesn't seem like the real story is being reported. And so then it became about contacting organizations to find out how to get there. And pretty quickly, we realized that feasibly it was going to be a bit of a nightmare. I couldn't go through Jordan because the border is closed because of coronavirus, and also because I'm an American citizen, so I couldn't go into regime-held areas of Syria. So then it became Turkey or Iraq, and after talking to some people in Iraq, we realized I'd be able to fly into Erbil and drive to the Syrian border. But of course, we had to stay in Kurdish areas the whole time because I'm also not allowed into federal Iraq areas. So we're on the way to the airport now. I'm a little nervous just because you never know what to believe about Syria. Many people say the area where we're going, Qamishli, is very safe, and I don't want to be one of those Americans that's very, stereotypical about Syria. At the same time, I want to be cautious. The challenge is going to be I only have a translator for the hours that we are actually inside the camp. So the rest of it's just going to be, كيفك كيف حالك ما بحكي عربي منيح. So we'll see how that goes. When I got to the airport, I was told that I was not allowed inside of Erbil, which was very strange because I had been there before, and of course we checked that there were no travel restrictions, and there continues to be nothing about any restrictions on the American or Kurdish government website. But either way, they promptly took me into a holding cell in the basement. No food or water or SIM card, so no way to call the American embassy. So I'm WhatsApping my colleagues at Ru'ya using airport Wi-Fi, and luckily enough, they were able to make some calls, and about 4 hours later, they said okay, and I entered. So that was Thursday, and then Saturday, because the border is only open Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, I went to cross the border. And even though I had all of my Syrian permits, the Iraqi side said, we will not allow you to go to Syria. They said they wanted a letter from my company, from the Ministry of Interior, from my embassy, what have you. I didn't know if this was because it looked suspicious, you know, an American woman trying to cross the Syrian border alone, or what. But at the end of the day, you know, it's an illegitimate border. It used to be controlled by the regime before the war. So this is a case of, you know, not being able to just look up on the website what the exact procedures are. And I'm saying this not to center myself or my story, but to really stress the point that perhaps the reason that accurate stories aren't reported is because the camp is not particularly, you know, accessible. There are not a lot of people trying to cross that border to begin with. I go back to Erbil, start making some phone calls, and finally on that Wednesday, the Iraqi side let me cross, and by Thursday morning, myself, a translator, and a photographer were on the way to the camp. The road from Qamishli to Hol is pretty uneventful, agricultural, you know. We talked a lot about the war along the way. It's been 10 years, and just the previous week, President Biden had ordered airstrikes on the Deir ez-Zor. So 10 years later, you have so many groups still fighting for power. You have regime forces, you have the SDF, within that you have the PKK and the YPG. You have Iran-backed rebels, Turkish-backed rebels, Russian troops, American troops, and, you know, small pockets of Daesh. A lot of people that I spoke with said there's a tendency to trust American forces, who we actually would see in the camp, which was really surprising to me, despite having been disappointed by their ability to really protect the Kurds in recent years. Still, though, there is a major controversy about what exactly they're doing in northern Syria. They say they're there to keep Daesh out and to protect the oil fields. But of course, there is no more controversial topic in especially northern Syria than the oil fields. I talked with a lot of people about the needs of the Syrian people today, and the answers certainly varied. But a lot of people mentioned the state of the economy. Before the war, $1 was the equivalent of about 50 Syrian pounds, and today that rate is closer to 4,000. So when we're talking about poverty in Syria today, we're not just talking about displacement or destroyed homes or the massive unemployment rate, but we're also talking about the extreme devaluation of the local currency. So we're going into this knowing that whatever is happening inside the camp, whatever's happening outside of it is not particularly pleasant either. And I think that context is really important, because once you can understand that the entire country is suffering, you can stop sensationalizing the events of the camp itself. When we arrived at the camp, we were brought into a room to speak with management about exactly what we needed from them to do our story. I said I wanted to conduct interviews with the Palestinians in the camp, the Arabs. Specifically, I wanted to speak with the Palestinians, and we want to find out if they're 1948 Palestinians or if they went to Syria in recent years to fight with Daesh. We were told by management that they could not get us interviews because they themselves don't know who lives in what tent, and they don't go into the areas where the tents are. And that was very surprising to me, because it was probably the first indication of how little anybody really knows about the inner workings of this camp. So then they told us that the camp is separated into a Syrian Iraqi section and a foreigner section. If you're in one section, you don't have any contact with the other. We go into the foreign section first, and we're in this big open plaza where until 2 p.m. every day, people can buy their food, shoes, what have you. I think the word I would use to describe the people I spoke with in that section would be kind of a mix of hostile and hesitant. Though I can't say if that hesitancy came from a place of fear or having been misunderstood by the media in the past, or just the fact that I'm obviously an outsider and not covered in the way that they are. I really don't know, but they were definitely hesitant to speak. Everyone I spoke with denied being a Daesh affiliate. They said they came to Syria in the last 10 years because it's the most Islamic place on earth. And unlike what I would experience in the Iraqi-Syrian section, there was not this overwhelming, please help me leave, I need to leave. It was more of a calmness, almost a complacency. But also when I look at previous media coverage, you see a lot of that obsession with Daesh, when in truth, we don't know if all of these women went with their husbands willingly or if they believe in Daesh's ideology whatsoever. So why would they trust the media with their stories? Despite the amount of big agencies that have gone in and reported on this, there has yet to be any sort of international protocol established, whether that be, trying these people in an international court of law or what have you. These people are left in a camp with no cell phones and effectively no access to the outside world. And so I remember I asked one Russian woman, is this a camp or is this a prison? And she said, it's somewhere in between. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, that's exactly what the world expects it to be. So then we went over to the Iraqi-Syrian section, and it was just night and day. The surroundings, the busyness, the fact that people really wanted to speak about their experiences. At one point, I had maybe 50 people surrounding me, and most of the time they weren't wanting to speak to me as a journalist, but just someone from the outside who might be able to, answer some of their questions. People were asking, do you know where my husband is? Is it true that they torture kids in prison?
فاحنا نريد اولادنا. انا ابني عندي 2000 مواليد 2000 وسنه 2002 ما اعرف عنه لحد الان من فقد ما اعرف عنه كل شيء. زلمتي مصاب واخذوه ما اعرف زلمه كبير ما اعرف عنه كل شيء.
An image that really sticks out to me is one of this maybe 6-year-old woman crying and using the fabric of her face covering to wipe her eyes, because in that moment I realized just how human she was and how rare it is that we humanize people in that camp. And so I would say that was a big turning point in the story for me, because it was when I realized that it wasn't just about hearing stories or reporting stories, but about changing the narrative entirely, that everybody in this camp is somehow a perpetrator of violence or a supporter of violence, because that's absolutely not true. From 2014 to 2018, 10,000 people fled to the camp with the help of the SDF to escape Daesh's approaching presence. And then in 2019, after the Battle of Baghouz being Daesh's last bit of territory, the population of the camp shot up to around 70,000. And that's when you start hearing it being called a Daesh camp, because you did have Daesh affiliates mixed up in these people, but you also had people that were loosely affiliated with Daesh or perhaps worked with them but didn't completely support their ideology. And then in 2019, UNICEF came out with this report that it supports the 40,000 people fleeing from Hajin, which is near Baghouz, to the camp. But somehow in the last 2 years, the narrative changed, that it wasn't just about Daesh victims, but it became about Daesh affiliates. The victims really became just an afterthought. Actually, I wouldn't even say afterthought, because nobody even knows that there are any Daesh victims at the camp.
احنا انجبرنا يعني انعدينا ويا داعش، لان احنا من صار الجيش تقدم على الفلوجه كلها طلعت، الإله لازم والما إله لازم. فكنا انسحبنا وصرنا ضحايا يعني سواء داعش أو مو داعش.
Syria has been repatriating people in phases, but people say it's slow, and it also really depends on where in Syria you're from. If you're from an SDF-held area, well, then it's a lot easier than if you're from a regime or rebel-held area. If that's the case, it's going to be a while. And even with the plan, which shouldn't be overlooked because Syria really is the only country that's trying in mass to repatriate its citizens, there are a lot of barriers with leaving the camp, even for Syrians. Inside, if you don't have documentation, that makes it very difficult for the SDF to trust that you are who you say you are. But with so many people having fled in emergencies, a lot of people don't have passports or identity cards, so absolutely a huge impediment to leaving. But then also, if you do get a chance to leave, a lot of people are surprised at what they're going back to. Homes, entire cities have been destroyed. The economy has been destroyed. Many people lost their kids, husbands, wives, and are also going to be dealing with that Daesh stigma inside Syria.
ما عندنا أي معلومات، إحنا هو شيء غامض يعني المخيم شيء غامض يعني ما جاي نعرف شنو السبب. يعني واحنا ما لنا ذنب يعني ما نعرف شنو جاي يصير. يعني وانتم مخلينا هنا خايفين علينا من الحكومة. يعني مالتنا مال العراق.
Knowing that it's very important to talk about the Iraqis.
أنا أريد أطلع العراق لأن هنا ما لي أي علاج بسوريا. أي علاج بسوريا. أنا أطلب منكم بس طلب واحد أريدكم تطلعوني على العراق. وعربات تعبان حيل. والله حيل تعبان. هسه أنا هذا العصب عندي حيل متعب. أنا ما لي أي علاج بسوريا. والله ما لي أي علاج بسوريا.
Iraqis have just as big a population in the camp as Syrians, but with no plans to repatriate. What's also really interesting is that they're arbitrarily linked with Syrians in nearly every way. For example, there's a foreign section and an Iraqi-Syrian section. But we're in Syria, so are the Iraqis not just as foreign in Syria as Russians, for example?
وأنا هل تشوفون ترى والله الليل ما جاي ينام والله الذي لا إله غيره والله الذي لا إله غيره أنا الليل ما جاي ينام تدون الصحيح والله الليل ما جاي ينام الليل كله علم من العصب وبالرجلية اثنيناتهم حيل يوجعني وأنا حيل متهذي يعني أطلب منكم بس شغلة واحدة بس طلعوني على العراق ما أريد منكم كل شيء بس طلعوني على العراق.
It's not a linguistic or regional designation either. All other Arabs are on the other side. It's not a timing thing because the 10,000 that came pre-2019 were predominantly Syrian. When I asked why the sections were classified the way that they are, I was not given a straight answer. And the frustration on behalf of the Iraqis, it's very clear. It's palpable.
على حسب الإذاعات بالتلفزيون بالموبايلات أنا ما عندي موبايل بس حسب يعني بالموبايلات بالتلفزيونات يقولون رافضين الرحل إلا مسعود البرازاني بأربيل هو مطالب بالعراقيين يعني إذا نروح الأربيل الحمد لله.
I remember that one of my interview questions was what the PCR positivity rate in the camp was. And that answer turned out to be 0 because while there was a vague understanding of what coronavirus was, there was definitely no feeling that it would be able to do any more harm onto the people than what's already been done there. Through the years, there have been so many different outbreaks of disease, dysentery, typhoid, etc., and it's because there is no substantial medical care. There's not a lot of anything really. Food, water, money, medical care, education.
وعلاج أهم شيء العلاج أأكد على شغلة العلاج الناس جاي يصير عندهم أمراض يعني ما يقدر يسيطر على الإسهال والإزواء وغير شغلات خصوصية الأطفال يعني ولا الكبير يقدر ياخذ عشبة يتحسن وضعه شوي، بس الطفل الصغير العلاج ما له أي علاج. يعني هنا العلاج ما جاي يتحسن ويا الأطفال الصغار، خاصة الأطفال والكبار بالسن هم يعني يعانون من هذه الأمراض.
These services would normally be provided by NGOs within the camp, but because of a multitude of reasons, including coronavirus and the stereotypes surrounding the camp, a lot of organizations are simply hesitant to enter the camp and perform any sort of work there.
مخيم الهول حاليا يضم حوالي 60,000 شخص بين السوري وعراقي وأجانب. دائما هناك نقص في الخدمات التي تقدم لهم، سواء من الناحية الطبية من الناحية الخدمية. نشتكي كثيرا من هذا الموضوع. مثلا في الجانب الطبي يعني قلة خدمات طبية، قلة نقاط طبية، قلة مشافي اختصاصات متعددة. لذلك نضطر بإحالة معظم المرضى ضمن المخيم إلى مشافي الحسكة. هذه مشكلة عانينا منها كثيرا منذ 2 تقريبا، رغم اجتماعاتنا مع المنظمات بشكل متكرر لا يوجد حل لهذا الموضوع. نفس النقطة قلة الخدمات، قلة الأدوية، يعني نقص كثير في الأدوية عم يكون. النازح واللاجئ ضمن المخيم عم يعاني كثير من هالموضوع، انه يعني من وين بده يجيب الأدوية إذا النقاط والصحة العالمية وغير المنظمات الصحية ما عم تقدر توفر لي هالدواء.
In February, an aid worker was murdered in the camp. That person was actually one of more than 30 who were murdered in January. Most died from handmade sharp objects or from guns, most of which have silencers and are smuggled into the camp.
طبعا وصل إحصائيات الجرائم خلال 2021 إلى ما يقارب 31 جريمة قتل. بالمجموع العام منذ دخول النازحين إلى مخيم الهول بلغ عدد الجرائم تقريبا 76 جريمة قتل. طبعا اختلفت الأدوات، فببداية الأمر كانت الأداة التي يعتمد عليها في الجرائم هي أداة حادة. وصل عدد الجرائم بالأداة الحادة إلى 6، بينما بطلق رصاص تقريبا 26 حالة. طبعا الحلول تكمن لدى الجهات الأمنية، فهي المسؤولة عن ملف الجرائم والملف الأمني والسيطرة على المخيم بشكل عام.
So there has been a huge uptick of violence in the camp. 30 murders in what is supposed to be a refugee camp is absolutely unheard of. And I did ask, because we have 2 designated sections, I said, where did the murders happen? And interestingly, they did say all of the murders happened on the Iraqi-Syrian side. There hasn't been any murders in the foreign section. But the question becomes, why? The short answer is that there is a Daesh presence in the camp. People are getting murdered for not subscribing to Daesh's rules. How can they have such a presence in the camp? Because there's 1 guard for every 60 people. But there's a very important differentiation to make here. People are not being killed because they want to be Daesh or because they're being mixed up in Daesh, but simply because they do not want to be Daesh. So if that's the short answer, that an increased Daesh presence in the camp is causing the violence, the long answer is much more complicated and nuanced. It's not only that these kinds of camps can often be radicalization and recruiting breeding grounds, but it's also that people don't have the basic necessities to live. People are living with other people from all different pockets of society. And also because people have no idea when they're going home or if they ever will go home.
خوف يعني الليل كله ما ننام، بالنهار ما تأمن على نفسك. يعني وضعنا حيل تعبان، حيل ما يفيد. يعني احنا والله حاطيننا بالمخيم سادين عينين ينطونا قضائية. احنا شلنا بالقضائية إذا ما مأمنين علينا هنا. المريض ما له أي نتيجة، المحروق ما له أي نتيجة، الصوبات بالدقيقة يطق عليك ما تعرف تسوي له أي شيء. خيام ما ينطونا، كل سنة نضل ذبحات يلا ينطونا خيمة.
Painting that wholesome picture is so important because it is Daesh. But Daesh plus the idea that experts have long warned against any sort of prolonged time in these camps. So once we're able to first get the story right, that is, understand that there are victims in these camps, and secondly, humanize these people for the refugees that they are, that's when we have the best shot of allowing these people to go home. And it was my belief 4 months ago, and it is certainly my belief now, that as an Arab news station, particularly as an Arab news station in a country that hosts some of the highest numbers of refugees in the world, that we have the very best shot at changing this narrative and finally giving people some answers.
ساعدونا فليساعدكم. اطلعونا نريد ولادنا.